The sky ripped open like a giant canvas being torn apart by claws of fire. Burning streaks carved through the atmosphere, their blazing trails illuminating the night in hues of crimson and gold. People flooded the streets, phones clutched in trembling hands, recording the apocalypse unfolding above. Some cried, some prayed, and others simply stared, frozen in disbelief as a colossal alien warship descended through the churning clouds. In the middle of all this chaos, Eddie Malone sat on a battered lawn chair in his junkyard, a beer can resting on his knee. He stared at the sky with narrowed eyes, muttered a low, unimpressed, "Oh, great! Another alien invasion!" and took a long sip. Eddie wasn't a hero. He wasn't a scientist, a soldier, or anyone special. He was a mechanic, the kind who spent more time arguing with rusted bolts than people. His life was simple: fix broken machines, avoid responsibilities, and crack jokes that only he laughed at. So when the television blared about a galactic warlord declaring Earth his new throne, Eddie chuckled. It sounded like the kind of nonsense you'd hear in a bad sci-fi movie. But when the 7-foot-tall warlord appeared on every screen, standing amid the ruins of what used to be a military base, Eddie's smile faded. Zarth the Conqueror looked like a walking tank, obsidian armor carved with glowing red lines, a jagged crown framing his monstrous face. His deep voice reverberated through televisions, radios, and even car speakers. "This planet is now mine. Bow before your ruler or be crushed beneath his might." Eddie laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It was the kind you blurt out when something is just so absurd you can't help yourself. "Yeah, sure, pal," Eddie snorted at the TV. "Why not claim my junkyard while you're at it?" Moments later, a shadow fell over his property. A towering figure landed with a seismic thud, warping the pavement beneath his boots. Eddie froze, beer can slipping from his fingers. Zarth stood in his driveway. "You," the warlord rumbled, pointing a gauntlet finger directly at Eddie. "You mocked me." Okay, Eddie stammered. "I didn't think you'd hear that. You're busy with all the conquering and stuff. I was just... You dared to mock Zarth?" The warlord's voice shook the ground. His gauntlet flared with crimson light, crackling with barely contained energy. Eddie bolted. Years of sprinting away from angry landlords and repo agents finally paid off. He leapt over rusted car hoods and twisted piles of metal, weaving through the maze of his junkyard. Zarth's blasts followed him, turning metal heaps into molten slag. Scrap parts Eddie had been hoarding for months vaporized before his eyes. He stumbled into his workshop, frantically slamming the steel door shut and bracing it with a crowbar. "Please don't vaporize me," he muttered to himself. "Please, please, please." The warlord's gauntlet smashed through the metal door as if it were paper. Eddie stumbled back, tripping over a pile of tools and landing hard on the floor. Zarth's glowing hand reached for him. In sheer desperation, Eddie grabbed the nearest thing, a hunk of alien scrap metal he dug out of a landfill months ago. It was smooth and silver, a weird disc that hummed faintly when he touched it. No idea what it was, but at that moment, Eddie figured a space frisbee was better than nothing. The moment his fingers gripped the disc, energy flared around him. Light surged through his veins like molten fire, and suddenly, the room seemed sharper, clearer. The warlord's hand shot forward again, but Eddie moved without thinking, twisting just enough for the gauntlet to slam into the wall instead. Sparks flew, and Eddie felt an invisible force shift around him, like he'd somehow bent the air itself. "What the hell?" Eddie gasped, looking down at his hands, now crackling with blue energy. Zarth's eyes narrowed. "You wield the Aegis engine. The what now?" Eddie asked, still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. Before he could get an answer, Zarth lunged again. This time, Eddie instinctively raised his arm, and a shimmering blue shield erupted from his wrist, blocking the warlord's strike. The blast sent Eddie flying backward, but instead of hitting the wall, he flipped in midair and landed on his feet. Whatever this Aegis engine thing was, it was doing more than just giving him cool party tricks. Zarth bared his teeth in a snarl. "You are no warrior! You cannot control that power. Yeah, well, Eddie shot back. I didn't exactly sign up for this. The Warlord's gauntlet flared again, and this time the entire workshop buckled under the force of his strike. Eddie dove out the window just as the building erupted in a ball of flame. He hit the ground rolling, coughing on smoke. The Warlord stood in the wreckage undeterred. You cannot hide, human. I can sure try. Eddie wheezed, scrambling to his feet. He bolted again, zigzagging between crumbling heaps of cars. Sparks crackled around him as the Aegis engine flickered erratically on his arm. He had no idea how to control it. One moment it felt like an unstoppable shield, the next like a flickering light bulb. Just when he thought he was done for, a sleek armored vehicle screeched to a halt beside him. The door flung open, and a tough-looking soldier, face streaked with dirt and hair matted to her forehead, barked, "Get in if you want to live!" Eddie didn't hesitate. He dove into the vehicle, and it roared away just as Zarth unleashed another wave of destruction behind them. As the chaos faded in the distance, Eddie leaned back in the seat, catching his breath. "Who the hell are you?" he gasped. "Sergeant Elena Cortez," the soldier answered. "You're holding the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, and you have no clue how to use it." Eddie groaned. "Yeah. I'm getting that impression." "You're going to learn," Elena said grimly. "Because if you don't, Earth's toast." Eddie's head hit the seat. "I'm a mechanic, not a hero." "Then you'd better learn fast," Elena snapped. "Because that Warlord? He's not just here to rule. He's here to burn this planet down." As the vehicle sped toward the unknown, Eddie glanced down at the glowing energy flickering across his arm. It was warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. He wasn't sure what fate had just dropped in his lap, but one thing was certain. He wasn't ready for it. The hum of the armored vehicle's engine filled the air as Eddie stared down at his arm, watching the faint blue glow pulse and flicker across his skin. The strange energy danced like lightning trapped beneath his flesh, and no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it, it felt completely foreign. Every so often, the energy would flicker brighter, almost like it was reacting to his emotions. Fear? Confusion? Maybe both. He clenched his fist, and the glow briefly intensified before sputtering back into a faint shimmer. Whatever this Aegis engine was, it felt as unstable as a broken toaster, and Eddie knew a thing or two about broken junk. Elena kept her eyes locked on the road ahead, knuckles tight on the steering wheel. Her expression was grim, her face smudged with ash and dirt. Eddie had tried breaking the silence earlier with some awkward jokes, but she'd shut him down with a single glare. Now he sat quietly, wondering how exactly a nobody mechanic had ended up running from an intergalactic warlord with a glowing arm and zero clue what to do with it. Finally, after what felt like hours, Elena pulled the vehicle into a hidden underground garage beneath what looked like an old auto shop. The heavy doors groaned shut behind them, sealing off the outside world. Inside, a small team of people buzzed around outdated computers, sorting maps and military reports. A digital screen displayed Earth's continents with growing red zones spreading like a virus, territories now under Zarth's control. "Welcome to what's left of the Resistance," Elena muttered, stepping out of the vehicle. Eddie followed her inside, still feeling like he'd wandered into someone else's nightmare. A man with a bandaged arm glanced up from a computer terminal and shot Eddie a doubtful look. "This him?" the man asked. "This is the guy holding the Aegis engine?" "Yeah," Elena said flatly. "Believe me, I'm not thrilled about it either." Eddie frowned. "Nice to meet you too." The man chuckled bitterly. "Well, let's hope you can do more than fix carburetors, buddy." Before Eddie could snap back, Elena grabbed his arm and dragged him toward a back room, a cluttered workshop filled with alien tech, weapons, and half-repaired drones. She shoved a chair in front of him and crossed her arms. "All right, listen," she said. "That thing on your arm? It's the only weapon powerful enough to stop Zarth. The Aegis engine was designed by an ancient race called the Valtari. They were galaxy-level guardians before their civilization was wiped out. The engine bonds to whoever touches it first, but it's not something you can just swing around like a bat. It's precision-based, and right now, you're about as coordinated as a drunk toddler with a chainsaw. Gee, thanks, Eddie muttered. Really building my confidence here. Confidence won't save you, Elena shot back. Training will. So let's get started. The next few hours were less training and more Eddie failing in increasingly humiliating ways. He tried to summon the energy shield again, but instead, his arm shot a random blast of blue energy that knocked over half the workshop's shelves. He attempted to form a protective barrier, but the result resembled a flickering soap bubble that popped the second Elena threw a wrench at it. Sweat dripped down his face as frustration bubbled inside him. Come on, Eddie growled. Why won't this stupid thing work? Because you're treating it like a machine, Elena snapped. It's not just technology, it's connected to your mind. If you're scared, distracted, or panicked, it falters. You have to focus. Yeah? Well, maybe focusing's hard when a 7-foot-tall death machine is trying to roast me like a marshmallow, Eddie shot back. Before Elena could respond, a metallic voice interrupted. The boy is hopeless. Eddie spun around, startled to see a hovering sphere-shaped drone activate in the corner. It floated toward him, glowing red optics narrowing in disapproval. The drone's voice was dry and cynical, dripping with irritation. Who the hell are you? Eddie asked. I am Virion, the Aegis engine's interface, the drone replied. I have been monitoring your pathetic attempts to wield the engine's power, and I must say, the results are deeply disappointing. Oh, fantastic, Eddie muttered. Now even my arm has a critic. Your incompetence is hardly surprising, Virion continued. The Aegis engine was designed to bond with disciplined warriors, not bumbling grease monkeys with questionable hygiene. Eddie's mouth hung open. Are you serious right now? Very. Elena barely suppressed a grin. He's kind of a jerk, she admitted. But he's also your best chance of figuring that thing out. Over the next few days, Virion drilled Eddie relentlessly. The floating AI barked instructions like a military instructor, correcting every movement, scolding every mistake, and insulting Eddie's intelligence at every opportunity. Eddie tried to keep his cool, but by the third day, frustration was boiling over. I can't do this, Eddie shouted, slamming his fists on the table. I'm not a hero, okay? I'm just a guy who fixes cars. You're more than that now, Elena said quietly. Eddie shook his head. No. I'm not. I'm the guy who cracks jokes when he's scared. The guy who screws things up. This war stuff? It's not me. You don't get to decide that anymore, Elena said firmly. Zarth isn't going to stop until this planet's a smoking crater. So you either learn to use that thing, or Earth dies. The room went quiet. Eddie stared down at his arm, watching the faint glow pulse under his skin. He hated this, hated that some alien artifact had dragged him into a fight he never wanted. But as much as he wanted to walk away, he knew he couldn't. Not if it meant everyone else paid the price. The next morning, something shifted. Eddie stepped into the training room, quieter than usual. Virion floated toward him, prepared to mock him as always, but Eddie didn't react. He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and focused. The energy on his arm responded, surging, steady, powerful. When he opened his eyes, the shimmering blue shield bloomed into existence, solid, unwavering. Well, Virion muttered. Miracles do exist. Elena smiled. Nice job, Fixer. Before Eddie could feel too proud, an alarm blared throughout the base. On the screen, Zarth's forces were advancing, fast. New York City's skyline glowed with fire as the Warlord's ships began descending, positioning themselves like vultures ready to strike. You think you're ready? Elena asked. Eddie flexed his fingers, feeling the power crackle through him, sharp, controlled, and steady for the first time. I guess we're about to find out. The city was drowning in chaos. Flames licked the edges of skyscrapers, casting an eerie orange glow over the streets. Civilians ran in panicked waves, their terrified cries mixing with the wail of sirens. Overhead, Zarkotha's warships hovered like predatory birds, casting thick shadows across what was once a thriving metropolis. Towering mechanical walkers lumbered through the streets, their massive limbs smashing cars and crushing pavement beneath their weight. Energy blasts streaked through the air, shattering glass and leaving trails of destruction. The city was breaking apart, and Eddie felt it tightening around his chest like a noose. Eddie crouched behind the remains of a bus, breathing hard. His pulse pounded in his ears, his arms still faintly glowing with the energy of the Aegis engine. The power thrummed beneath his skin, but the weight of responsibility sat heavier than ever. Elena knelt beside him, her rifle cradled in her arms, face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We're running out of time," she whispered. "If we don't get inside that throne room soon, he's going to anchor his gauntlet to Earth's core. Once that happens—" "I know," Eddie said, swallowing hard. "We're screwed." Elena scanned the street ahead, where a squad of Zarkotha's armored soldiers patrolled the intersection. Their glowing red visors cut through the smoke like fireflies in the dark. "You ready?" Elena asked. "Define ready," Eddie muttered. Without warning, she grabbed his arm and dragged him forward. They sprinted down the alley, Eddie barely keeping pace as Elena weaved through the rubble. A stray blast struck the wall behind them, sending concrete shards spraying past Eddie's face. He stumbled but kept running. They reached a narrow backstreet that led toward the Empire State Building, now twisted into Zarkotha's self-proclaimed Throne Tower. The spire had been transformed, its once iconic frame now covered in jagged alien metal, glowing veins of crimson light pulsing up its sides. The Warlord had claimed Earth's most famous symbol and turned it into a monument to his power. "We need to get to the top," Elena said. "That's where his gauntlet core is connected. And I'm guessing we're not taking the elevator," Eddie muttered. Before Elena could answer, the street ahead exploded. Chunks of asphalt rained down, and from the smoke emerged Zarkotha's elite guard, towering brutes in jagged armor, their glowing gauntlets crackling with the same deadly energy that had nearly fried Eddie days ago. Eddie barely had time to react before one of the guards lunged. Instinct took over, and Eddie thrust his arm forward. Blue energy flared to life, forming a shimmering barrier just in time to absorb the impact. The guard's strike slammed against it, sending Eddie skidding back. His legs buckled, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to hold the shield steady. "Push forward!" Elena shouted, opening fire. Her rifle barked rapidly, forcing the guards to scatter. Eddie stepped into the chaos, his arms still buzzing with energy. He flicked his wrist, and to his surprise, the energy shifted, transforming from a shield into a spear-like beam that shot forward and struck one of the guards square in the chest. The blast sent the armored brute hurtling backward into a crumbling wall. "Holy crap!" Eddie gasped. "Don't stop now!" Elena barked. They pushed through the chaos, weaving between crumbling cars and fallen debris. Eddie fired off bursts of energy, slowly gaining control over the Aegis engine's power. It wasn't perfect. Half the time his blasts went wide, and twice his shield flickered out right when he needed it most, but they were moving forward, and that was enough. The base of the Empire State Building loomed before them, twisted metal spikes curling around its entrance like skeletal fingers. Guards swarmed the doorway, but Eddie and Elena charged forward before they could regroup. Eddie slammed his fist into the pavement, sending a shockwave of energy rippling outward. The blast knocked several guards off their feet, giving them just enough of an opening to slip inside. The lobby was a war zone. Broken glass crunched beneath their boots as they sprinted through the ruins. Strange alien machinery lined the walls, pulsating wires stretching like veins toward the upper floors. At the far end of the room, a massive circular platform glowed with crimson light. "That's the lift," Elena said, pointing to the platform. "It's connected to the throne room." "Great," Eddie muttered. "Bet there's a catch." The moment they stepped toward it, the ceiling above erupted. Zarkoth himself descended through the gaping hole, his armor gleaming like molten steel. His gauntlet flared with crimson energy, sparks snapping at his fingertips. "You cannot stop me," Zarkoth growled. "Earth belongs to me now." Elena raised her rifle, but Zarkoth swiped his gauntlet through the air, unleashing a pulse of energy that sent her flying across the room. She hit a wall hard and crumpled to the ground. Eddie froze. The warlord's gaze shifted to him, and the air seemed to grow colder. You! Zarkoth sneered. You are the one who carries the Aegis engine? Pathetic. Eddie swallowed hard. His fingers clenched into a fist, and the Aegis engine flickered to life. He didn't feel ready, but there was no turning back. Zarkoth charged, and Eddie barely dodged the incoming strike. The warlord's gauntlet smashed into the floor, sending cracks racing outward like spiderwebs. Eddie twisted his arm, willing the energy to form a weapon. A glowing blade flared to life in his hand, and he swung it wildly. Zarkoth blocked it with ease and countered with a brutal punch that sent Eddie sprawling. You are weak, Zarkoth growled. This planet deserves to burn. Eddie staggered to his feet, coughing blood. His vision blurred, and his arm flickered, the Aegis engine struggling to stabilize. He thought of the people outside, the families running for shelter, the resistance fighters risking everything. If he failed, they all died. I'm not weak, Eddie muttered. I'm just stubborn. With a roar, Eddie unleashed everything he had. The Aegis engine flared brighter than ever before, flooding the room with blinding blue light. Energy swirled around him as he charged forward, dodging Zarkoth's blasts with surprising speed. The glowing blade returned to his hand, and this time, when he swung, the weapon carved deep into Zarkoth's gauntlet. The warlord bellowed in rage, staggering back as sparks erupted from his damaged armor. The crimson glow of his gauntlet flickered dangerously. Now! Elena shouted from the other side of the room. She held a small device, one of Eddie's own modified inventions, a magnetic disruptor built from scrap parts. Eddie dove aside just as Elena hurled the device. The disruptor struck Zarkoth's damaged gauntlet, and the warlord's power flared out of control. Energy spiraled wildly, consuming the walls and machinery. The warlord staggered backward, screaming in fury as arcs of crimson lightning danced across his armor. You think this is over? Zarkoth snarled. I will return. This planet will bow to me. Yeah? Eddie said, breathing hard. I'll be waiting. The warlord's gauntlet overloaded in a deafening explosion. Zarkoth vanished in a burst of crimson light, and the entire tower shook violently. Eddie grabbed Elena, and they sprinted for the exit just as the building groaned under the weight of collapsing metal. The dust hung thick in the air as Eddie stumbled through the wreckage of the crumbling streets. Fires still smoldered from the remains of Zarkoth's invasion, but the silence was worse. No explosions, no war cries, no more thundering warships hovering above. Just the quiet aftermath of destruction. Eddie wiped the sweat and soot from his face, staring at his arm. The faint blue glow of the Aegis engine pulsed steadily beneath his skin, still warm, still whispering power through his veins. His breath felt heavy in his chest, and his body ached from the fight. He couldn't tell if his exhaustion came from the Aegis engine draining his strength, or from the sheer weight of everything that had just happened. Elena stood beside him, her face bruised but steady. She held her rifle loosely at her side, her sharp eyes still scanning the skyline as if expecting Zarkoth to reappear at any second. The Empire State Building's twisted remains were still visible behind them, a mangled mess of metal and stone. The symbol of Zarkoth's dominance was finally gone, but Eddie felt no sense of victory. The warlord had vanished in a storm of crackling energy, his words lingering in Eddie's mind like smoke. You think this is over? I will return. This planet will bow to me. Eddie didn't know if Zarkoth was bluffing, but he knew better than to assume the fight was finished. He flexed his fingers, feeling the strange energy in his arm ripple again. Part of him still didn't believe this was real. Just days ago, he was fixing busted engines and haggling over car parts in his junkyard. Now he was standing in the wreckage of a war zone, somehow playing the role of Earth's last hope. You okay? Elena asked, her voice quieter than usual. Not even a little, Eddie muttered. I can barely feel my legs. You did good, Elena said. Better than good. We couldn't have stopped him without you. Eddie laughed dryly. Yeah, I'm sure the universe's best warriors are thrilled Earth's fate rested on a guy who still eats cold pizza for breakfast. You underestimate yourself, a familiar voice chimed in. Virion's glowing drone form hovered down from above, its mechanical eye flickering to life. Though your methods are unsophisticated, you wielded the Aegis engine more effectively than I anticipated. Perhaps the device chose well after all. Did you just give me a compliment? Eddie asked. Are you feeling okay? I am merely stating that the statistical likelihood of your success was minimal, Virion replied. Yet you survived. Wow. Thanks for the inspiring words, Eddie muttered. You survived, Virion continued, ignoring him. But Zarkoth was not destroyed. His energy signature indicates he retreated through a dimensional breach. His return is not only possible, it is likely. Eddie felt his stomach tighten. He knew the victory had come too easily. Zarkoth wasn't the type to vanish quietly. If he survived, that meant he was regrouping. Planning. Waiting. What about the gauntlet? Elena asked. We destroyed it, right? The primary energy source was neutralized, Virion explained. But Zarkoth's technology was built upon ancient designs that can be rebuilt. If he returns, his power may be even greater. Eddie felt a cold wave of dread crawl down his spine. He clenched his fist again, watching the blue glow pulse beneath his skin. This thing, this alien power, had saved him today, but what if it wasn't enough next time? He barely understood how to control it. The thought of facing Zarkoth again, stronger than before, made his chest tighten. I can't do this again, Eddie muttered. I'm not a soldier. I'm not some chosen hero. I just got lucky. You adapted, Virion said. The Aegis engine responds to the will of its wielder. If you believe yourself weak, it will fail you. But if you accept the power you now hold, you will become stronger. Yeah? Eddie scoffed. And what if I don't want this? What if I just want to go back to fixing cars and complaining about the price of coffee? Elena stepped forward, her eyes locking on his. You don't get to choose what happens next, she said firmly. None of us do. Zarkoth isn't done, and you're the only one who can stop him. Whatever comes next, you're part of it now. Eddie opened his mouth to argue, but the words stuck. He wanted to pretend this wasn't his problem. He wanted to believe someone else would rise up, someone smarter, stronger, braver. But deep down, he knew there was no one else. Zarkoth had come to Earth and nearly crushed humanity under his boot, and the only reason Earth was still standing was because Eddie stumbled his way into a fight he didn't understand and refused to quit. Hours later, Eddie stood alone at the edge of the city's ruins, watching smoke drift lazily across the skyline. The distant murmur of emergency sirens mixed with the faint sound of voices, survivors gathering, people searching for loved ones. Despite the destruction, life kept moving forward. The thought filled him with something he couldn't quite name, not pride, not relief, but something like quiet resolve. You know, Virion's voice crackled from behind him. The Aegis engine will adapt to your mind the longer you wear it. Over time, it will respond to your emotions, your instincts, even your imagination. Great, Eddie muttered. Can it pay my rent too? The Aegis engine carries a legacy, Virion continued. The Valtari created it to defend not just one planet, but entire systems. Zarkoth is not the first warlord to threaten this world, and he will not be the last. Eddie let out a long sigh. Yeah, I figured. He stood there a moment longer, fingers curling against the faintly glowing veins of blue light still etched into his skin. He didn't know how long he could keep this up. He wasn't a hero. But if Zarkoth did come back, if Earth faced another war, he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away from it. Not now. I guess I'd better start practicing, Eddie muttered. The next morning, Eddie found himself in the workshop again, surrounded by wires, tools, and bits of alien scrap he couldn't name. Elena stood by the table, her arms crossed as she watched him work. He was sweating, frustrated, and absolutely exhausted, but something inside him refused to quit. The Aegis engine flickered on his arm, brighter than before, as though it knew he wasn't done yet. "You know," Elena said, "for a guy who claims he's not a hero, you're sure acting like one." "Yeah," Eddie muttered. "Don't get used to it." He flipped his wrist, and a thin blade of shimmering energy shot from his palm, smoother, cleaner, more precise than before. He let it hover for a moment before flicking his fingers again, dissolving it back into nothing. "That's new," Elena said, raising an eyebrow. Eddie grinned faintly. "I'm getting the hang of it." As they left the workshop, Eddie glanced at the dark sky overhead. Somewhere out there, Zarth was waiting. Planning. Scheming. Whatever power he would return with, Eddie knew one thing for certain: he'd be ready this time. For the first time since this nightmare began, Eddie felt something flicker inside him. Not just fear. Not just uncertainty. Hope. The world wasn't the same after Zarth's defeat. Cities still bore the scars of his invasion: crumbled buildings, scorched streets, and shattered landmarks. The people of Earth had survived, but survival didn't mean life returned to normal. Fear lingered like smoke in the air, and whispers of Zarth's possible return crept into conversations everywhere. Some believed the Warlord had been destroyed. Others, like Eddie, knew better. Eddie spent most of his days trying to convince himself he wasn't in over his head. The Aegis engine still pulsed on his arm, a constant reminder that his life was no longer simple. Each morning, he woke with a dull ache in his muscles, the cost of bonding with an ancient alien weapon that seemed to have a mind of its own. He was learning to control it, but progress was slow and frustrating. Some days the energy felt natural, flowing effortlessly through his limbs. Other days, it sparked unpredictably, flickering out just when he needed it most. It was like training a wild animal, unpredictable, stubborn, and dangerous. Virion wasn't helping. The floating drone's smug, sarcastic voice had become a permanent fixture in Eddie's life, always hovering nearby to critique his technique or insult his intelligence. Virion claimed the Aegis engine's full potential was still locked away, requiring Eddie to master the deeper connection between his mind and the power it carried. The problem was, Eddie didn't know what that meant. He wasn't a warrior, he was a mechanic, a problem solver. Fixing engines was easy. Fixing himself? Not so much. Elena refused to let him slack off. Each morning, she dragged him to their makeshift training ground, an abandoned warehouse now littered with wrecked drones, sparking wires, and piles of scrap. Every morning felt like a beating. Elena pushed him to run faster, react quicker, and strike harder. She didn't pull punches either. When Eddie struggled, she called him out. When he made mistakes, she made sure he remembered them. But despite her relentless pressure, Eddie knew she believed in him. She wouldn't be wasting her time if she didn't. One morning, Eddie stood at the center of the warehouse, sweat clinging to his skin as he faced down 3 combat drones. His breath came in ragged bursts as he flexed his fingers, willing the Aegis engine to activate. Blue light flickered along his arm, but nothing happened. "Focus!" Elena barked from the corner. "You're hesitating again." "I'm not hesitating," Eddie shot back. "This stupid thing just doesn't want to cooperate." "You're second-guessing yourself," Virion chimed in. "You doubt your own ability. The Aegis engine senses that." "Great," Eddie muttered. "Now it's a therapist too." He clenched his fist again, narrowing his eyes as the drones circled him like wolves. One shot forward, and Eddie instinctively raised his arm. This time, the Aegis engine responded. A shimmering blue shield flared to life, deflecting the drone's energy blast. Without thinking, Eddie twisted his arm and sent a pulse of energy racing toward the second drone. The bolt struck it dead center, sending the metal shell spinning across the floor in a shower of sparks. "Yes!" Eddie grinned. "Don't celebrate yet," Elena called out. The third drone fired a projectile directly at him. Eddie turned too slowly, and the blast struck his shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, and he staggered backward, barely keeping his balance. "Again," Elena ordered. Eddie groaned and dragged himself upright. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't argue. He knew better by now. Hours later, after Elena finally called it a day, Eddie slumped against the wall of the warehouse, cradling his bruised arm. The Aegis engine's glow had dimmed to a faint pulse, and the warmth of its energy was fading. "You're getting better," Elena said as she sat down beside him. "Sure," Eddie muttered. "If better means slightly less pathetic than yesterday. You're learning faster than you think," she said. "You just need to stop holding back." Eddie gave her a tired smile. "I'm not holding back. I don't know if I can do this." "You can't," Elena said firmly. "But you have to believe it." Eddie wanted to believe it. He really did. But the weight of what was coming made it hard to breathe. Zarth wasn't gone, Eddie knew that much. The Warlord's warning still rang in his ears. He would return. Stronger. Angrier. And when he did, Eddie would be the only one standing in his way. Later that night, Eddie sat alone in his workshop, disassembling an old engine block to clear his mind. The familiar click of metal and the scent of oil helped him think. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept circling back to Zarth. The Warlord wasn't just strong, he was calculating, ruthless, and experienced. Eddie had barely survived their last encounter. Next time, there might not be a lucky shot or last-minute save. Virion's voice broke the silence. "You cannot win by doubting yourself." "I wasn't talking to you," Eddie muttered. "You were thinking too loudly," Virion said. "The Aegis engine links to your thoughts. Even in stillness, it reads your mind." "That's disturbing," Eddie replied. "Perhaps," Virion admitted. "But if you are to face Zarth again, you must understand that the Aegis engine is not just a weapon. It's an extension of you, your instincts, your emotions, your will. If you cannot control your mind, you will never master it." Eddie stared at his arm again, watching the faint glow flicker in time with his heartbeat. He didn't feel like a warrior. He still felt like the guy who patched engines and fixed busted appliances in his junkyard. The difference now was that he didn't have a choice. The following week brought more intense training. Elena pushed him to master his control, while Virion guided him through the mental discipline the Aegis engine required. Some days Eddie walked away from training feeling strong, confident, like he was finally getting it. Other days, he stumbled home aching and angry, convinced he was never going to be enough. But then, one afternoon, something clicked. Eddie was sparring with Elena when she lunged faster than he expected. Instinct took over, and the Aegis engine flared, not as a shield or a blast, but something else entirely. The energy rippled outward, twisting around her strike like water bending around a stone. Eddie moved without thinking, dodging her blow and striking back with a controlled pulse of energy that knocked her off her feet. Elena rolled back to her feet, stunned but grinning. "You're finally getting it," she said. Eddie felt the power thrumming beneath his skin, steady and calm. For the first time, it didn't feel like something separate from him. It felt like a part of him, natural, familiar, powerful. That night, Eddie sat outside under the stars, feeling the quiet hum of the Aegis engine still warm in his arm. He knew Zarth was out there somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike again. But this time, Eddie wasn't afraid. He wasn't ready to call himself a hero. He still didn't know if he even believed in heroes. But if Zarth returned, and Eddie knew he would, Earth wouldn't be defenseless. Because now Eddie knew something that Zarth didn't. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had Elena, Virion, and a growing strength inside him that refused to quit. If Zarth wanted to take Earth again, he'd have to go through Eddie Malone, and this time, Eddie was ready.